welcome to Week 11's forum. It's quite a big turnout, so thanks guys for coming along, even though it's almost swapped back. Who came to last week's forum? Cool. I actually wasn't there, so well done, you beat me. So last week and this week were a part of our series on suffering, which is kind of tied in with the biomed FGs. Sorry, the biomed FG. So this week and last week were a forum kind of catering to the idea of suffering from both a medical perspective as this week, and last week was from more of a general kind of theological perspective. So if you didn't hear last week's talk, it should be online, right? Yep. So on the CU YouTube account, so you can find it there. Andy Prideaux was the speaker. But this week we have Justin Denholm come along to kindly speak for us on more of a medical approach to suffering, but also tying in to a Christian framework and making sense of suffering in that way. So I'm going to hand it over to him, and he will further introduce the topic, but let's give him a warm welcome.
Thanks, and thanks for having me along again. I love seeing that this is week 11, and full disclosure, Andy and I haven't had a chat about these talks, and I think that's better because, well, there's lots of reasons, but one of the things is that these are difficult and challenging issues, and they should be difficult and challenging. And it's quite likely that, you look at this disclaimer down the bottom that I was smiling to myself about, that, what I'm going to say doesn't necessarily express the view of the Christian Union. But the reality is that everybody has a personal experience of suffering, as well as lots of different contexts in which they'll encounter different sorts of things. I've met a number of you before, but for people I haven't spoken with, I've got a couple of perspectives that will come through as I talk. I'm a medical doctor. I'm an infectious diseases physician at Royal Melbourne Hospital, and my particular gig there is to run the tuberculosis program. So that's where a lot of my context of medicine happens just at the moment. My background before that was in ethics largely, and I ran the Centre for Applied Christian Ethics at Ridley Theological College for a few years, and it's been just a great pleasure to drop in and out of CU activities for a number of years now, and have some chats intermittently about all of this. So what I thought I'd do is just start by telling you a couple of stories about tuberculosis. These are all real things, by the way, but I'm conscious I'm being recorded, so I'll blur some of the details just a little bit. But can I ask you first, who remembers Year 12 exams? Yeah, most of you. Some of you were possibly unconscious, a little bit of retrograde amnesia shortly thereafter. Very sensible. And who remembers that as a fun and stress-free period of time? Less hands. I see less hands. Okay. So some years ago, I met a young woman who was getting ready for her Year 12 exams. And she had a story that probably sounds familiar to a lot of people, which was that she'd been studying hard all year. She'd really gone into herself, was feeling pretty flat, hadn't been feeling great physically, hadn't been getting out, hadn't been eating very well, had noticed that she'd lost a few kilograms, got this cold that she couldn't shake, and then she was coughing, and suddenly, before she realized it had been 6 months that she'd been coughing and losing some weight and really wasn't feeling all that well. And so she eventually got along to see her GP, who sent her to see me, and we diagnosed her with pulmonary tuberculosis. No great shock, given the title. The reason why I always remember her is that tuberculosis had this enormous impact around her life. And I'll tell you just one thing that happened. She came into hospital, and she was admitted for a few weeks. Again, this is sort of lead up to exams and so forth. And it took me some weeks to meet her parents. And it took me weeks because they were very scared. They didn't want to come into hospital. They'd heard the word tuberculosis. They had some ideas about it. And it took the better part of 3 weeks before I got them to physically come in the building so that I could talk to them. And when they came in, I found that one of the things they'd done in those intervening 3 weeks was they had gone to her room, and they had taken everything her clothes, her study notes, her bed, and they had piled it in the backyard and they had burnt it. And so I've got this 17, 18-year-old who is trying to get ready for her exams, who has a family that doesn't want to come and see her because they're afraid of her at this point in time, and has had that sort of impact there. Now, she got treatment and she recovered well physically, ultimately. I'm not sure that her relationship with her parents has ever recovered from that time, but that is one little way that tuberculosis impacted her life, and there are many others we could talk about. There was another young man that I saw a few years ago who'd been living in Australia for a couple of years. He'd come from a subcontinental country, and his wife and baby had been living in one room of a share house. He was working in a service job to support them. And then he started coughing and he couldn't stop, and he came to hospital. Eventually he too was diagnosed with TB. And while he was in hospital, his landlord and then his boss found out that he was sick. His boss immediately fired him. And because he couldn't pay his rent, on the day he was being discharged from hospital, his landlord put his wife and child out in the street as well. So he's sick. He's been in Australia working on a 457 visa. He now has no income, no welfare entitlements. He's trying to take care of a family while he's being made homeless. He might have thought about going back to his home country, but he's blocked from doing so because of international travel restrictions while you've got active tuberculosis. So even if he could have afforded it, which he couldn't, it wasn't an option open to him. I don't know if circumstances in your lives have ever conspired to such a great degree that you feel so helpless and isolated. But to sit and talk to him, I certainly found at the beginning that he was one of the most desperate and despondent people that I've worked with. And it's all because of the TB impact coming into an already vulnerable life. Last very short story. Last year, a 20-year-old young man came to see his doctor with a few weeks of cough. He was investigated and diagnosed with TB of the lungs. He was started on treatment pretty quickly. And then a couple of weeks later, his infection eroded into a big blood vessel in his chest. And he came quickly to the emergency department by ambulance, but the bleeding couldn't be stopped, and he died not long after starting on TB therapy. TB is something that causes a huge impact in the world in lots of different ways. And I could have started by telling you about some of those numbers, about how nearly 11 million people got TB last year and 1.5 million of them died. The World Bank likes me to talk about the economic impact of TB and the suffering that it causes in this sort of geopolitical level, with an estimated $3 trillion in lost productivity last year. And those are all big numbers. And when we think about that big scale of what a disease like TB does in the world, it's appropriate for us to think about those big numbers. But there's an abstract quality to big numbers too. And so I wanted to frame what I'm going to say today with letting you know that even here in our rich and pretty privileged and well-supported country, TB is causing suffering. It's causing physical and emotional suffering, damage to relationships, and unfortunately even death. Now, as a Christian, this kind of pain and suffering in the world is quite confronting. We say that there's a God and that he is powerful and he's good. This is by no means a unique problem with TB, but you can see where I'm going with this. If God is good and he loves people, he has the power to intervene, then how can this kind of suffering be allowed in the world? Isn't it true then that God either doesn't really love people, or he does, but he's not able to prevent this kind of suffering? I think there are two ways that we respond to this, and they're both important for us to unpack a little bit. The first is theological. And I'm going to be interested afterwards to hear how my comments in this space line up with some of the things that Andy's been talking to you about. But when I say theological, what I really mean is, what does this experience of suffering and what we can learn about it, what does it tell us about God and who God is? The second one, though, is personal. The second one is, how do we live well in a world that feels like this? We have a particular experience of suffering. We have things around us. What does it look like for us to live well in light of suffering? So let me start with the first. Why is there suffering in the world, and what does it tell us about God? Most fundamentally, I think we need to start by admitting that this is a really difficult question. I've heard other people speak about this before, and sometimes it is tempting to give an answer that goes something like this. God made a perfect world. Humans broke it. God could fix it at any moment, but doesn't because he's given us free will. That is, he deliberately holds himself back so that we are freely able to choose, if we will, what we do with our lives, essentially. Now, there are some true things about those statements, but there's also some problems with it. And one of the biggest problems for me comes from the fact that this view essentially confirms the emotional force of the problem that we have with suffering. That is, when you are suffering, the view says to you that God knows, God could do something about it, but chooses not to in order to promote some actually kind of abstract philosophical idea. And that, whatever the theological validity to that, it feels pretty thin to me. And I think a lot of suffering people have trouble connecting that view with what we see in the God of the Bible, who loves us and wants us to thrive. Even more problematic is a view that we sometimes hear that says that suffering is actually good for us. Maybe because it tests us or it makes us stronger, or because we don't recognize that it's leading to something even better. Now, suffering can do those things, it's true. And many people have spoken and written about how their own experiences of suffering have ultimately been positive. It's dangerous territory, though, because it implies that God might actually inflict suffering on us. And because, again, there are a lot of times in our lives and in the lives we see around us where suffering doesn't actually seem to have a purpose, at least as far as we can tell. One of the parts of the Bible that I find most helpful in engaging with the question of suffering is the book of Job. Job, you remember, is an upstanding man who's had a series of terrible tragedies that have occurred, sickness and financial ruin and the death of his family. And he's reduced to almost nothing. And on top of it, he's surrounded by his wife and his friends, whose mission in life through the book of Job seems to be to make him admit that all of his suffering is his own fault. The book of Job is it's a long exploration of what suffering is all about. And I was reading through it again recently, and the tension just keeps building up. Something happens. His friends come, his wife comes. They accuse him in different ways. Job keeps suffering, but refuses to admit either that he's done something wrong or to curse God for inflicting suffering on him. And then in the end, the bit that I find most fascinating is that God himself appears. He turns up and comes to Job and his friends. And this is the point where what I would expect is a kind of literal deus ex machina, right? This is the point where God turns up and he fixes everything, right? He turns up and he explains everything, and there you go, that's the end of the book. But he just doesn't. He tells Job's wife and friends that they're wrong, and he reminds them that he's the Lord of creation. He made everything in the world, and he understands it in the way that they can't. And he says to Job that he hasn't done anything to deserve punishment, but reminds him that he's also not an all-powerful God who can expect to live in the world and control it in such a way that avoids suffering. But he doesn't offer Job a simple answer to the question of suffering. And Job's response to that is what I'm most struck by. Because after God speaks, what Job says to God is, "You're right. I'm not all-powerful, and I don't understand a lot of what's going on here. What I do understand is that you know everything, and you are the Lord of all, and I'm going to keep coming to you and questioning this. I'm going to keep coming to you and telling you that I don't understand and that I'm suffering. And I'm going to listen for whatever it is you have for me in this. And this, I think, is the really powerful climax of Job, which lies at its heart in recognizing that there's suffering in the world, that there are some answers to be had, and they're there to be looked for in a conversation with a powerful and a personal God, and that we might not understand all the answers. So instead of being dogmatic here today and trying to answer the question directly of why there is suffering in the world, in the same spirit, I wanted to offer you 5 things that I think are true about suffering from the Bible and from our experience of suffering, and then come back to 3 things that we can do in how we live in light of it, how we respond to the presence of suffering in the world. So, 5 things. First of all, there was never intended to be suffering in this world. But we do live in a world where a lot has been broken and deranged by our separateness from God. In Genesis 2, we see a world made by God which is not full of pain and death, and people and God living in harmony in the earth. We often concentrate on the brokenness of the world and the disharmony that we see around us. But I think it's also helpful for us to remember that we only recognize that things are bad in the world because deep down we understand that the world is not fundamentally meant to be like this. We feel a sense of injustice and wrongness about suffering in the world because we understand that that's not how it was intended to be. That's one thing. The second thing is that when we come to a specific topic like this one, and we think about something like a disease, I think we have a tendency to think that diseases are external. They're abstract, they're kind of neutral, they're imposed on us from the outside. But what I want us to take seriously is that an extremely high proportion of the pain and suffering that comes from TB actually is related to things that other humans do. TB rates historically rose because of poverty, overcrowding, migration into cities. People die today because drugs are unavailable, which is largely because of financial decisions from companies and governments and healthcare systems around the world. If you think about the stories that I told you at the beginning, you see people evicted from jobs and houses because of fear and ignorance. Stigma, fear, poverty, none of these are inflicted on people by God. It's other people who are causing this suffering. And we need to remember this when we plan our own reactions and response. We saw that in the story of Job, too, because we're seeing his friends, or so-called friends, trying to add stigma and guilt to his pain. That's 2. Number 3. The third thing is that we focus on the suffering that we see, but we can't forget that we're never going to see what gets prevented. Right? When we talk about suffering, there's this implicit trap that we can fall into, which concludes that all suffering is a sign of God's inactivity. Okay? That is, we see pain, and we think that that's there because God hasn't fixed it. And so every hurt in life reinforces the idea that God doesn't help. What we need to remember in this space, though, is that we, Christians, do believe that God intervenes. We see evidence of times that God heals and rescues, and we should thank God for the pain and suffering that he does relieve. It may also be that there's a lot more suffering in the world that is actively held back by God. By definition, we're never going to know about things that don't happen, but as a public health physician who spends a lot of time trying to prevent disease, I have some sympathy for the lack of gratitude that we see about that. You don't know what you don't know. Okay. Number 4, as we saw in Job, we can accept that we don't understand fully, and we're not going into in this life. Instead, where that leads me to is feeling that we need to rely on God's character rather than a conclusive philosophical argument in this space. The relationship that Job shows us with God is an amazing one. It's a questioning, doubting, uncertain conversation between us and an all-powerful God. And a God who, I might add, is big and strong enough to deal with our doubts and worries and pain and uncertainty. In the Psalms, we see many times that real pain and suffering is brought to God, and it's not always resolved. In Psalm 88, for example, we hear, "My soul is full of troubles, afflicted and close to death. I'm helpless. My companions have become darkness." It's bleak, it's unresolved, but it's a heartfelt cry to God. And it's followed immediately by Psalm 89, where the psalmist can also recognize that God is strong and steadfast, that he has given help to his people time and time again, that his name is blessed forever. It's God's character that we have confidence in, and in an ongoing relationship which lasts through good times and times of suffering. Finally, for these 5 points, there will be a time in the future when there is no longer pain and suffering. This is a really important one for me, and so we're going to come back to it later. But the key here is that just like the world was not meant to be full of suffering, there is also going to be a time when it's no longer like this. So, 5 very short things about why there's suffering in the world, and some of the windows that gives us into who God is and how we relate to him. But in practical terms, what do we do with this? What do I do with living life in this world that's full of suffering related to TB, in my case? I'd like to give you 3 things that this talk has been really helpful for me in thinking about a couple of the ways that I do and want to relate to this sort of suffering in light of what I think as a Christian. So I want to give you these 3 insights that I have found helpful in terms of shaping the way my life and work in this particular space operates. But I hope that there's some general principles, though, that make sense more generally. So the first thing about how I engage with suffering, or how I want to engage with suffering, is to sit with it, because I worship a God who sits with me. It's easy to rush past this point in thinking about responding to suffering. When I'm faced with somebody who's in pain, they have problems, I want to help them escape from it. To be honest, I want to escape from it. Sometimes it is very uncomfortable to sit with suffering. It is extremely difficult to watch somebody else in pain. And as much as I want to help them to feel better, I also recognize that a lot of my desire to help other people is because of my own real discomfort in sitting with suffering. But when I look at how God deals with me, I realize that Jesus Christ came into the world, first of all, not only, but first of all, simply to share in the experience of suffering humanity. Jesus was hungry, he was tired, he cried and he grieved, he comforted people who were in pain, and ultimately, he took all the suffering that the world could inflict, and he died. And at any moment, he could have removed himself from that situation. For me, the person of Jesus, who suffered for us and with us, reminds me that sometimes the most powerful thing that we can do in the face of suffering people is actually just to be with them, to be present, to know them and acknowledge them the way that Jesus did. that can be a very hard thing for me. I find that very difficult. But the experience of the powerful and loving presence of Jesus is key to shaping how I want to be present with people who are suffering. Second thing. The second thing is that we look for small ways that we can act in concert with God's purposes, that we can use what He's given us to relieve suffering. Now, I'm really fortunate in my work because I have the chance to manage staff and resources around TB. And when I'm able to use the resources of our hospitals, our healthcare systems, our government, to counter the effect of individuals counter the effect of TB on individuals and their families, I'm very conscious that I'm doing that as God's servant. And this, I think, is a real part of my own understanding of God's nature that comes from wrestling with suffering. Because God does care, and we have the great privilege of partnering with God in alleviating the effects of suffering in the world. Think about the stories that I told you before. So that Year 12 student was supported by the TB program through her exams, to the extent actually that we had to invigilate her exams because they wouldn't let her back in the classroom. She's now passed, did well enough to get into uni, has finished her degree, is now a few more years down the track there. And I caught up with her last year, and she was very excited to tell me about the triathlon that she's planning to complete soon. So some great recovery there. My patient from the subcontinent was provided with really extensive support through his period of homelessness and instability. That included mediation with his employer and his landlord, provision of emergency housing and food packages. We also managed to connect them through the program in with a local church who provided regular meals and clothes for his daughter and some social support for them. He and his wife are Muslim, by the way, and they couldn't stop talking about how shocking it was, actually, to be cared for by a local church. There are so many ways that we're able to positively intervene in people's lives, quite apart from giving tablets or a specific treatment for the disease itself. The thing is, though, even with the best will and resources in the world, treatment fails sometimes, and people die sometimes, and families are damaged beyond any capacity that I have to heal. That young man with severe TB in his lungs still died despite everyone's best efforts. And the balm that we have is temporary, and it's transient, and it's imperfect. And that brings me to the last thing that I wanted to say, which is that one other thing that we can do, all of us, in the face of suffering around us, is that we can point people towards and remind each other of the ultimate end of suffering and the hope we have for release. I was at an international TB conference a couple of years ago, World Health Organization, a lot of country-level TB programs and departments of health. And we were talking especially in this case about the terrible epidemic of TB affecting Papua New Guinea, particularly drug-resistant disease, which has become one of the most serious issues that the country's facing at the moment. And I was in the program to speak after their Minister for Health. And he got up and he did something I've never seen anyone do before at an international conference. He got up and he pulled something out of his pocket, and it wasn't notes or a speech or anything like that. It was a Bible. And he got up, and he opened his Bible, and just very slowly while people watched him, he found Jeremiah 8:22. And he read, "Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician? Why then is the health of the daughter of my people not been restored?" And he went on to talk about all of the terrible suffering from TB and PNG and the magnitude of the response that was needed from the international community. Now, I'll let you in on a little secret. The international public health community is not necessarily all that biblically literate. And I wasn't sure that they'd really grasped the context of what he was talking about in making that reference. And I had to follow on from this very powerful and personal talk that he'd given. And so I quickly changed what I was going to say as well. And I started out by pointing out that the words from Jeremiah were a rebuke to all of us there, all of us who had resources and balm, things that could help relieve suffering, but for all of the reasons that we were talking about, had failed to restore health to the suffering people of Papua New Guinea. There was something else, though, that I wanted to talk about, which was another vision about tuberculosis that we have in the Bible, which we get from the book of Revelation. And so I read from Revelation 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and first earth had passed away. God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear, and there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. I said that this vision was something else that we all shared. A longing to see a world, a time when suffering from TB is no more. It's something for us to hold on to as we work. You see, the goodness of God is what allows us to understand the problem of suffering correctly. It's the goodness of God that penetrates through that veil of pain and misery and opens our eyes. The parts of the Bible that the PNG health minister and I read are both right. The verses from Jeremiah should remind us that we're in a world where bad things happen, and we should fight against them. The verses were written to rebuke a world where resources are available, but they're not used to relieve suffering. And it's the responsibility and the moral duty of all of us who have access to them to use them to help others in need, especially the most vulnerable. Ultimately, though, it's the Revelation vision that sustains me. What the vision of Revelation 21 shows me is that God's heart is for healing and wholeness. The vision shows me that God intends for this world to be made perfect, for all of our suffering to be ended, and for us to live in perfect fulfillment with Him forever. The pain and suffering caused by tuberculosis and by failed exams and broken relationships and financial hardships, it'll be gone one day. And we can live in a world where it will be just as it was always meant to be. I don't know about you, but that gives me something very central to the work I do to hang on to as I work. It's a vision that sustains me when everything I try is manifestly inadequate, which is very frequent. It's a very central vision for me, and I hope that it's one that also might stay with you as you go on and encounter suffering in lots of different forms in the world. So I might stop there, but I'm very happy to answer any questions or to talk a little bit more afterwards as well.
Yeah. We might just say thank you now, and then we can move on to questions. Yeah, thank you so much for coming in. I'll hand it over to you if anyone's got questions. That's
fine. I'm very happy to take questions if people want, but it's also sometimes easier to have conversations about difficult areas like suffering one-on-one afterwards. So I'll be around for a little while, and I'm very happy to talk to you individually too. Can I pray for you guys?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Lord God, thank you so much for the people in this room. Thank you for these people who are here because they want to know you and they want to live in light of knowing you. God, suffering is hard for us and for others. It's hard to understand, it's hard to experience, and we don't understand it. Help us to be people who keep coming back to you with our uncertainties and our doubts. And please help us to grow to be strong and faithful people who hold on to the fact that you love us as we work out how to live in this world. In Jesus' precious name we pray. Amen.
We might finish there, and then if you want to stay and chat with Justin or chat with Taylor, we've got 10 more minutes at least in this room. So please feel free to make use of that and hang around for a little bit. There's tea and coffee still there if you want to go grab something. But thank you for coming, guys. Next week, final week of forum, Helen Bell, who's sitting over there, is going to be speaking to us on the topic of rest. Which hopefully will be an appropriate one for week 12. Hopefully you guys can come on to that as well. But please do feel free to come up and ask us questions.
Thanks, guys.